July 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The examination room stands silent save for the rhythmic click of a tired ceiling fan overhead. Disinfectant hangs in the still air, mingling with the dust that seems to settle on everything in this corner of Texas. A young German woman, 24 years old, pauses in the doorway. Her legs tremble so violently she can scarcely bring them together. I cannot close my legs, she whispers to the American doctor waiting inside. He expects a war wound, perhaps, or some injury concealed beneath her faded uniform. Instead, when she removes her boots, he finds himself staring at something altogether different. Not blood, not shrapnel, but bone pressing through translucent skin, open sores weeping at the ankles, and the unmistakable evidence of prolonged starvation. Here was in one of the most prosperous nations on earth, an enemy prisoner has arrived at the very edge of death from hunger. What this doctor does next will alter the treatment of thousands of prisoners of war. This is the true account of collapse, survival, and one small room in Texas that would reshape modern medicine. Before we continue, if you find these lesser-known stories from history compelling, do consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel grow. The Army examination room was modest and oppressively warm that July morning. The scent of disinfectant burned the nostrils. Above, the ceiling fan pushed sluggish circles of heated air through the space. Pale sunlight filtered through the wire screen, casting faint lines across the worn linoleum floor. The door opened with a soft metallic complaint. A young woman in a German uniform stepped inside, gripping the doorframe as though it were her only anchor. Her name was Käthe Schmidt. 24 years old, yet she moved with the hesitant, pained gait of someone twice her age. An American nurse from the Women's Army Corps, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, stood beside her. "This way," the nurse said gently, guiding her towards the examination table some 12 feet distant. It should have been a matter of moments, a few straightforward steps. Captain David Morrison watched from beside the table. 42 years old, a physician from Philadelphia who had treated wounded men across North Africa and Italy. He had seen bodies torn by shrapnel, lungs drowned in infection, soldiers wasted by inadequate rations. He believed he understood what starvation looked like. "Please walk to the table," he said through the interpreter. Käthe pushed herself forward, one step. Her legs shook violently. The second step sent her hands shooting out to steady herself against the wall. She breathed as though she had climbed a steep hill rather than crossed 2 feet of floor. Nearly a full minute passed before she covered those 12 feet. Morrison felt something tighten in his chest. At 24, she ought to have been strong. Instead, each movement appeared to be a battle against gravity itself. It was the first indication that something was profoundly wrong. He began with the fundamentals. The nurse called out measurements as she recorded them. Height, 5'6". Weight, 87 pounds. 87 pounds at 5'6". A healthy woman of that height might weigh 9.5 stone, perhaps more. Morrison calculated quickly. Her body mass index sat somewhere around 14. Normal would be closer to 20 or 21. She was not merely thin. She was in genuine danger. Her blood pressure read low, pulse rapid but weak, temperature slightly elevated. Up close, her cheeks were hollow, her eyes appearing too large for her face. "I need to examine your legs and feet," Morrison said. "Please remove your shoes and socks." Käthe stared down at her boots. Her fingers trembled as she bent to work at the laces. The leather was cracked, rubbed to a dull shine at the heels. The room fell silent, except for the fan and the slow scrape of lace against the eyelet. I cannot close my legs," she said in halting English, not looking up. "They shake. It hurts here." She touched the sides of her knees, then her ankles. When she pulled off the first boot, the smell reached them. Old sweat, damp cloth, and something sharper. The unmistakable sourness of hidden infection. She peeled away the thick sock. Morrison looked down and, for a moment, his professional composure faltered. Her calves were little more than sticks wrapped in skin. Virtually no muscle remained. The bones of her shin and ankle jutted forward like the edges of tools beneath thin cloth. The skin itself appeared almost translucent, pale and stretched impossibly tight over the framework beneath. Her feet were worse. Each toe stood sharply outlined. The tops of her feet showed a delicate web of blue veins. Several toenails were broken or discolored. Around her ankles and along the sides of her feet were open sores, round, angry, some rimmed with yellow, others raw and red. In places, the shoe had rubbed straight through her skin to bone. Good God, hat das mir gesagt, the nurse whispered before catching herself. Morrison would later write in his report, lower limbs show extreme muscle wasting, multiple pressure ulcers on feet and ankles, some infected, edema present at ankles despite overall emaciation. He had witnessed hunger before. He had never seen it cut this deeply into a young woman's body. The strangest aspect was the swelling. Even at 87 pounds, her ankles were puffy, retaining fluid. The contrast was shocking. Skeletal legs ending in swollen joints. It was a classic indication that her body was failing, consuming its own tissues whilst desperately clinging to water and salt. How long have you had difficulty walking? The interpreter asked. Since January, perhaps February, Käthe answered softly. So the rations became small, then very small, then almost nothing. My legs, they stopped listening to me. In his notes, Morrison later recorded, patient appears 60 in gait, 24 in face. Body has been consuming its own muscle for months. This was not propaganda. It was reality laid bare in bone skin and infected sores. Outside the camp, American fields stood abundant. United States soldiers ate 3 meals daily. Inside this room, an enemy from the losing side could scarcely move her legs together without pain. It was a cruel paradox. In the richest food-producing nation on earth, the prisoner before them was starving to death. Morrison completed his initial examination in silence. He understood at once this was not simply a case of being somewhat underweight. It represented the endpoint of a long road of hunger that had not begun in Texas. To comprehend how a healthy clerk from Hamburg had arrived in America with legs like twigs and feet full of wounds, he would need to look back across the ocean, to the final desperate months of a collapsing Reich, and to rations that shrank day by day until almost nothing remained. If you're finding this account compelling, subscribing truly does make a difference. Now back to the story. To understand Käthe's condition in Texas, one must return to Germany months earlier, to a country running out of everything. In early 1944, Käthe Schmidt was an ordinary young woman working in a grey office, far from any battlefield. She served as a clerk in a supply office near Hamburg. Her work consisted of paperwork, lists of food, fuel, uniforms, train schedules, warehouse reports. Germany still presented itself as the land of order and meticulous planning. Trains departed on schedule. Forms received their proper stamps. Rations were carefully counted. Initially, the war merely brushed against her life. The air smelled of cold smoke and damp paper. The sound of typewriters and rubber stamps filled the room. Her ration card provided bread, a little meat, some fat. Not abundant, but sufficient. Then the bombing intensified. Hamburg was struck again and again. At night, the sky glowed orange. Sirens screamed. The ground shook beneath her feet. Warehouses burned. Railway lines twisted in the heat. Entire districts turned to blackened ruins. She remembered the taste of dust in her mouth, the grit that settled on her desk the following morning. As the destruction spread, the figures on her forms began to change. Trains that had always arrived now failed to appear. Warehouses that had always been full now reported almost nothing. Food promised to civilian workers was diverted to soldiers at the front instead. The rations became smaller, then very small, Käthe later told an American interviewer. At first they cut sugar, then meat, then even bread. We were told it was temporary. It was not. By late 1944, a standard German civilian ration in many cities had fallen to approximately 1,200 calories daily, far below what a young adult required to maintain health. On paper, workers like Käthe were meant to receive slightly more. In practice, the papers meant little when trains were bombed and depots empty. There was another cruel twist. Men at the front received highest priority. Factory workers came next. People like Käthe, who worked in offices and at telephones, were placed at the bottom. She worked in supply, yet she herself became amongst the last to receive supplies. This was the irony, as she said years later. We stamped ration papers that promised food we never saw. By January 1945, her meal had shrunk to thin soup and a crust of bread. Some days there was only the soup, mostly warm water with a few potato skins or pieces of turnip. The taste was weak and bitter. Her stomach growled throughout the day. Her body began to consume itself. The winter was cold. Wind from the river cut through thin walls and thin coats. Standing at her desk, she felt light-headed. Her fingers shook on the typewriter keys. Climbing stairs left her breathless. She noticed her skirt hanging loose, her belt requiring additional holes. By March, many in her office managed one proper meal daily at most. Some counted themselves fortunate to reach even 800 calories. Käthe and her colleagues attempted to laugh about it, but their laughter came out thin. We ate anything, she recalled. Dandelions, nettles, beet tops. Once there were biscuits, but they were mixed with sawdust to make them larger. We ate them anyway. In April, supply lines collapsed completely in some areas. Bridges were down, railway yards smashed. Her unit retreated westward from one makeshift post to another. Always walking, always hungry. Her boots, once tight, now slipped on her feet because she had lost so much flesh. The leather rubbed new paths into her skin. Each day of marching opened the sores deeper. There were days with no food at all, she said. We walked and tried not to think of it. Some people simply sat down and did not get up again. By the time British forces captured her group in May 1945, Käthe, at 5'6", weighed approximately 90 pounds. Her cheeks were hollow, her legs weak, her feet torn. The British provided basic rations, perhaps 1,600 calories daily, enough to arrest a freefall, but not to rebuild what had been lost. She was moved through temporary camps, then transferred to American control. The Atlantic crossing to the United States took roughly a fortnight. The sea was rough. The transport ship reeked of fuel, oil, metal, and many bodies in close quarters. Käthe was seasick for days. Food was there, but her stomach revolted at the smell. Much of what she swallowed came back up. She likely lost additional weight during that voyage. When the ship reached New York, she could barely stand through processing. Other women from her group, less debilitated than she, helped her. The 4-day train journey to Texas passed in a blur of rattling wheels, coal smoke, and short steps to the latrine, always holding someone's arm. By the time she reached Camp Swift, months of severe malnutrition had stripped away her strength. Medical officers would later estimate she had lived under true starvation conditions for at least 4 to 6 months. She was not a soldier from the front lines. She was an office worker, yet she arrived nearly a skeleton. The paradox was unmistakable. A nation once celebrated for order and planning had broken so catastrophically that even its supply clerks were starving. But in Texas, Käthe would soon learn she was not alone. When Captain Morrison began examining the other women from her transport, he would discover her story was not unusual at all. It formed part of a far larger pattern. Käthe's case remained with Captain Morrison long after she left the examination room. That night, in the dim light of a desk lamp, he composed a report more detailed than any he had filed previously. The office smelled of ink, old paper, and the ever-present carbolic from the nearby ward. He listed every measurement. Height 5'6", weight 87 pounds. Estimated BMI 14, severe underweight. Marked muscle loss in lower limbs. Multiple pressure sores on feet and ankles, some infected. Signs of vitamin C and DAD deficiency. Hair thin, nails brittle, gums inflamed. Condition life-threatening, without treatment. At the end, he added a line that extended beyond one woman. Recommend full examination of all female prisoners in this transport. Suspect prolonged severe malnutrition may be common. The following morning, he took the report to Major Thomas Henderson, the camp's chief medical officer. Henderson read it slowly, his lips pressing tighter with each line. "This is worse than we expected," Henderson said, looking up. "We knew Germany was short of food, but this is systematic starvation." "Or complete collapse of supply," Morrison replied. "Either way, if she is typical, we have a problem that our standard intake routine will not catch." Henderson nodded. "Examine the rest, all 30 women. Document everything. We need facts, not assumptions." For the next 3 days, the examination room became a quiet factory of grim revelations. One by one, the women from Käthe's transport stepped inside. The air remained constant, the sting of disinfectants, the faint smell of old wool uniforms, sometimes the sour odor of unwashed skin and old wounds. Morrison and Lieutenant Chun moved through the same procedures each time. Height, weight, blood, pressure, examination of hair, teeth, skin, then legs and feet. The numbers accumulated like grim statistics on a chart. Of the 30 women, 23 showed clear signs of serious malnutrition. 15 had body mass indices below 16, not simply thin, but dangerously underweight. 8 displayed bleeding gums, loose teeth, or bruises that matched no injury. Classic signs of scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. 6 had swelling in their legs or ankles, despite their bodies being nearly skeletal. One woman from Berlin whispered, "I used to weigh 65 kilos. Now I'm 42. I stopped looking in mirrors." Another, a telegraph operator, said, "We were told to be proud, to endure. But you cannot endure when there is nothing to eat." Their stories matched Käthe's. Rations cut repeatedly. Trains that never came. One thin soup daily by March, some days nothing by April. Office workers and radio operators far from the front had become the lowest priority in a dying system. Morrison's notes formed a pattern rather than a list of isolated cases. He wrote, "Findings consistent across majority of group, evidence of 4 to 6 months of inadequate calories and multiple vitamin deficiencies. Condition not due to individual neglect but to a wider breakdown." He took photographs as well with the women's permission, legs like sticks, shoulders like coat hangers, swollen ankles above warm boots. The click of the camera shutter sounded harsh in the quiet room. Years later, those black and white images would appear in medical lectures on starvation. When he had completed all 30 examinations, he assembled a second report, thicker than the first. It contained tables of heights and weights, summaries of symptoms, and a clear conclusion. These prisoners were not simply enemies to be processed. Many were medical emergencies. Major Anderson called a meeting of the camp's medical staff. The room was crowded with doctors, nurses, and coursemen. Windows stood open, admitting warm Texas air and the distant sound of lorries on the road. Henderson held up the report. "This is not an isolated case," he said. "Out of one transport of 30 women, more than 2/3 are seriously malnourished. Nearly half are in the severely underweight range. This is not propaganda. It is reality, and it is now our responsibility." He laid out new protocols, clear and firm. All incoming prisoners of war would receive a thorough medical examination that looked closely at nutrition. Anyone with a BMI under 17 would receive extra rations and medical oversight. Anyone showing signs of vitamin deficiency would receive supplements. Vitamin C, D, B complex, iron. Infected wounds would be treated before assignment to regular barracks. They would also establish a special ward for those requiring long-term nutritional care. Captain Morrison would organize it. One doctor asked, "Are we equipped for this level of care for enemy prisoners?" "We shall have to be," Henderson said. "The Geneva Convention demands adequate treatment. More than that, it is simply the right thing to do." The contrast was striking. German officers had filed papers whilst their own clerks starved. Now American officers were writing new protocols to protect those same former enemies. They had arrived expecting to guard prisoners. They were now in part protecting patients. As the meeting ended, plans began for a converted barracks. 20 beds, extra nurses, fresh supplies of protein-rich foods and vitamins. The next step would prove harder than counting calories on a form. It would mean rebuilding broken bodies one careful meal at a time, walking a narrow line between too little and too much. What transpired inside that new ward would test not only medical knowledge, but patience as well, as the staff learned how dangerous it could be to feed a starving person too quickly, and how slowly hope could return, ounce by ounce. A quick note, if you're enjoying this, subscribing genuinely does help us uncover more stories like this one. The new medical ward occupied a long wooden barracks at the edge of Camp Swift. The army had stripped out the old bunks and lined the walls with metal hospital beds. White sheets, thin pillows, a small table beside each bed. The air smelled of boiled linens, weak broth, and the sharp bite of disinfectants. 8 of the 30 women, including Käthe, were moved there first. They represented the worst cases, those who could not walk far or stand for long. When they lay flat, their bones pressed through the mattress. When they sat up, they tired quickly. Captain Morrison walked the row each morning with a clipboard. Nurses took pulses, temperatures, blood pressures. They recorded every figure: heartbeats per minute, degrees on the thermometer, pounds on the scale. These numbers would guide everything. Feeding them was akin to walking on a knife's edge. Too little food, and they would not recover. Too much, too quickly, and their damaged bodies could fail. Morrison had read about refeeding syndrome, a dangerous shock that could occur when a starved person suddenly received normal meals. Electrolytes, the salts in the blood, could swing wildly. In severe cases, the heart could stop. The plan was therefore strict and careful. Week 1, Morrison told the staff, no more than 1,200 calories daily, 6 to small meals, easy foods, broths, porridges, soft eggs if they can manage them. We watch closely. The first trays came rattling in. Thin oatmeal with spoonfuls of mashed potato, a small slice of soft bread, weak tea. To a healthy soldier, it would appear almost nothing. To these women, it represented more food than they had seen in months. Initially, Käthe ate slowly, more because she was instructed to than because she felt hungry. Her stomach cramped. She felt nauseated after only a few bites. There is so much, she whispered to the nurse, looking at the half-full bowl. My body has forgotten how to eat. But the nurses encouraged them onwards, one small spoonful at a time. If someone felt ill, the next portion was delayed, not cancelled. The aim was steady intake, not large meals. Morrison ordered daily weighings. The figures barely shifted in the first week. Some women gained a pound, some nothing at all. One lost a little water as the worst of her swelling eased. Do not be discouraged, he told them. Your body is learning again. This takes time. In week 2, calories rose to approximately 1,500 daily. The food grew slightly richer, more potatoes, a bit of meat, thicker soups. Vitamin tablets were added. Vitamin C for their gums and skin, vitamin D and calcium for their bones, B complex for nerves, iron for their thin blood. The tablets were chalky and bitter on the tongue, but vital. By the end of that second week, Käthe had gained roughly 3 pounds. It did not show much to the eye, but she felt small changes. The constant chill eased slightly. The sores on her feet, now cleaned and dressed each day, began to close at the edges. The swelling at her ankles started to fade as her body's fluids came back into balance. There is less fog in my head, she told Morrison during one examination, and I can think without such effort. It is strange. I almost feel guilty. Guilty for what? He asked. For eating so well when my mother is still in Hamburg, she said. She has less than this, I'm certain. The paradox was painful. In a land of plenty, the enemy prisoner was gaining strength, carefully counted calorie by calorie, whilst her family in ruined Germany faced empty plates. Weeks 3 and 4 brought further increases, up towards 1,800 calories. More protein appeared. Beans, small portions of meat, sometimes powdered milk stirred into drinks. The sound of spoons on bowls grew louder. Some women began to ask for seconds. That was a good sign. Physical therapy started in modest steps. Initially, it meant only sitting up longer than standing beside the bed, with someone holding an elbow. The first walks were merely across the ward and back. The floor felt hard under still tender feet, but the pain was less than before. By week 4, Käthe's total gain reached approximately 8 pounds. Her face softened slightly. Her hair no longer came out in clumps on the pillow. She could walk the length of the building without stopping, though she still held the bed rails. Morrison took fresh photographs, the same legs as before, but fuller now. The sores smaller, the skin less taut over bone. He wrote back, patient gaining approximately 2 pounds per week, muscle returning slowly, wounds healing, no signs of refeeding syndrome, emotional state improved. By week 8, Käthe was up roughly 15 pounds from her lowest weight. She could climb a short flight of stairs if someone remained close. By week 12, she had gained approximately 22 pounds in total, bringing her to about 109 pounds, still thin but out of the most dangerous zone. I thought I would die, she admitted one day, sitting in a shaft of warm sunlight by the window. Now I can imagine a future again. I did not expect that. Across the ward, others were making similar progress. The records showed a clear pattern. With careful feeding and vitamins, starved bodies could return. This was not propaganda. It was reality, written in rising weights and healing skin. As strength slowly returned, so did words. Morrison and Käthe began to talk more during their weekly checks. She spoke of Hamburg, of propaganda, of what she had been told about Americans. Those conversations, and the letters that followed, would soon reveal another strange truth. Sometimes an enemy camp could prove safer than home. By late autumn 1945, the air at Camp Swift had cooled. Mornings were crisp, and the ward's open windows admitted the smell of dry grass and distant wood smoke instead of only dust and heat. Inside, the women in the nutrition ward were different as well. There was still tiredness, but there was also quiet laughter. The clink of spoons, the creak of beds as people sat up unaided. Käthe could now walk across the compound without help. She weighed approximately 109 pounds, more than 20 pounds above her lowest point. Her legs still appeared thin, but she could climb stairs slowly, carry her own tray, even help fold linens at a table by the window. Her mind, once dulled by hunger, felt sharp again. With strength came questions. One day, during an examination, she asked Morrison, "How is it that I eat better as a prisoner than I did as a free person in Germany?" He paused before answering. "Because here, supplies still move," he said simply. In 1944, the United States produced more than enough food for its own people and for its armies overseas. Our rationing system limits choice but not calories. We have no true famine here. "But at home," she said, "we were told you were starving too, that American cities were in ruins, that your people were thin." Morrison shook his head. "No, our cities were not bombed like Hamburg or Berlin. Most Americans went through the war with full plates. This is the part propaganda does not show." This was not propaganda, Käthe would later tell her daughter. It was reality. I saw with my own eyes that the hungry enemy we were promised did not exist. As winter approached, the Red Cross informed camp authorities that some prisoners would now be permitted to send letters home. 6 months had passed since Germany's surrender. Mail routes were broken but slowly reopening. There was a limit, 1 or 2 short letters, carefully censored. Nothing about military matters. For Käthe, the hardest part was the first line. How did one tell one's mother, somewhere in ruined Hamburg, that she was safe, gaining weight, sleeping in a clean bed in Texas? She began simply. "Dear Mama, I am alive. I am in a camp in America. It is called Camp Swift in Texas. I am writing to tell you that I am well and that you must not worry." The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote about the final months of the war, the thinning rations, the endless walking, the sores on her feet, the day she could barely stand. "My legs stopped working," she wrote. "I could not close them without shaking. When the American doctor saw my feet, he was shocked. He said I was near death from hunger." Then came the strangest line of all. "The Americans have fed me and treated me. I have gained weight. I can walk again. They have been correct and humane, not cruel as we were told. I receive more food here than you probably do in Hamburg. I am grateful, but I feel guilty also. When the letter left Texas in December 1945, it traveled slowly through Red Cross channels across the Atlantic into a Germany where post offices were broken, streets blocked, and many buildings roofless. It took nearly 3 months to reach Hamburg. In April 1946, Käthe received a reply. The envelope was thin and worn. The paper inside smelled of damp and cold smoke. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than before. Dearest child, it read, I thank God that you are alive and healing. Do not feel shame for being fed. It is a comfort to me to know that somewhere you have enough to eat. Hamburg is in ruins. We live in 2 rooms with relatives. Our ration is small, but we survive. Come home when you're allowed. We will rebuild together. The contrast was sharp. In Texas, Käthe received 3 careful meals daily, plus extra bread and milk, as her weight returned to a healthy range of 8.5 stone. In Hamburg, a typical official ration could be far below 1,500 calories, and often much less in practice. Yet it was the mother in ruins telling the daughter in safety not to feel guilty. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. Whilst these letters moved slowly across oceans, Morrison's case files moved far more swiftly through the United States Army's own system. His reports on the 30 women at Camp Swift, with their tables of weights, symptoms, and recovery, were copied and sent to the War Department's Medical Command in Washington. In October 1945, a senior medical officer, Colonel James Bradford, arrived at Camp Swift to see for himself. He spent 3 days reading the files, examining the photographs, speaking with the patients. He walked through the ward, the smell of soap and stew in the air, past beds where women from the losing side now rested under American blankets. This is remarkable work, he told Morrison. You saw that this was not an isolated case. You changed intake protocols and built a program. You have more than 30 complete case histories with months of follow-up. This will shape how we treat prisoners everywhere. I was simply doing my job, sir, Morrison answered quietly. No, Bradford replied. You were documenting what happens when a modern state collapses and stops feeding its own people. These records will be studied for years, by doctors, by historians, perhaps even by those who plan for future crises. In that moment, the examination room in Texas became more than a place where one doctor and one patient met. It became a window into larger truths about war, about hunger, and about how an enemy's body can tell a story no speech ever could. Soon the war would be over for Käthe. Repatriation lists were being drawn up. Hamburg waited, damaged but still there. And long after she returned home, the papers that carried her numbers, 87 pounds, then 109, then 118, would continue to travel, shaping ideas about medicine, responsibility, and humanity. Those ideas, and the memories they carried, would not end with the war. They would follow both Käthe and Morrison into the peace and into history. In the spring of 1946, Käthe's name finally appeared on a repatriation list. The war was over. Ships and trains now carried prisoners back across the Atlantic instead of soldiers going the other way. On a warm Texas morning, the air smelling of dust and engine oil, she walked to the medical office for one final examination. Morrison looked at the figures on her chart. Height still 5'6". Weight now approximately 118 pounds. Her BMI, once around 14, was up near the lower end of normal. Her legs, once like sticks, now had shape. The scars on her feet were pale and closed. When you arrived, that's what he told her. I was not certain you would survive. Now you are healthier than many civilians in Europe. You saved my life, Käthe said quietly. You, the nurses, the food, the medicine. I shall not forget. I only did what any doctor should do, he replied. You were a patient who needed help. They shook hands. The room smelled of alcohol swabs and clean linen, just as it had the first day, but everything else had changed. She left the ward not as a skeleton barely able to stand, but as a young woman who could walk with her head up. Back in Hamburg, the shocker was different. When Käthe stepped off the train, she saw a city of broken walls and empty windows. The air carried dust, smoke, and the faint smell of burnt brick that never quite went away. Streets were blocked by rubble. Many buildings were mere shells. Rations were still small, often under 1,500 calories on paper, and sometimes less in reality. Yet she had one advantage now: a rebuilt body, some English and clerical skills. She found work with the British occupation authorities, helping to sort forms for rebuilding and rationing. The work felt strange but important. In a letter to Morrison in 1947, she wrote, "I now help organise food cards instead of stamps for soldiers. I think often of the irony. We once believed we would rule Europe. Now we queue for cocoa powder from you." They had come as conquerors. They left us as students, forced to learn from the people they had called enemies. In 1950, she wrote again, "Hamburg is slowly rising from the ashes. I have married a man who was also a prisoner. He was in France. He says he too was fed better in captivity than at home. We speak often of this paradox." By 1955, another letter said, "We have a daughter now. She is healthy and well fed. When she asks about the war, I tell her about Texas, about the American doctor who treated me as a human being. I want her to know that enemies can show kindness, and that this is not propaganda. It is reality I lived." Morrison also moved on. He was discharged from the army in June 1946 and returned to Philadelphia. But he did not forget the ward at Camp Swift. He opened a medical practice with a particular focus on nutrition and recovery. On his office shelves were thick folders from Texas. Over 30 complete case histories, more than 100 pages of charts, he has photographs and notes. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, he published several scientific papers using that data. One study detailed how carefully increasing calories from 1,200 to 1,800 daily, plus vitamins, could safely bring people back from severe malnutrition. Another warned about refeeding syndrome and established guidelines for avoiding it. These papers were soon cited repeatedly. Medical schools used them to teach young doctors how to treat famine survivors. In a 1978 interview for a medical journal, a reporter asked him, "What was your most important case in the war? A battle wound? A major operation?" Morrison shook his head. "It was a young woman who could barely walk 12 feet because she had been starving for months," he said. "Her case taught me that medicine is not about flags or uniforms. It is about seeing suffering and answering it." By 1995, a historian of nutrition who studied war and famine wrote, "The Camp Swift records created by Captain Morrison are amongst the most detailed documents of starvation and recovery we possess." His week-by-week measurements and careful photographs formed a template for modern treatment of severe malnutrition in crisis zones. The old examination room at Camp Swift was long gone by then. The camp itself had been dismantled. Fresh grass grew where barracks once stood, but in archives and libraries, the paper trail remained. Case files, tables of weights. The photograph of a young woman's wasted legs beside another, taken 12 weeks later, showing the slow return of flesh. Käthe died in Hamburg in 2001, aged 80, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known true hunger. Her daughter later donated her letters, including those to Morrison, to our city archive. Morrison died earlier, in 1988, aged 85. His family gave his wartime papers to a medical history collection. Researchers still open those boxes. They still see the numbers, 87 and 118, the notes about sores and vitamins, the quiet proof that care can cross battle lines. Their bodies were gone, the war long over. But the lesson from that hot Texas room lived on. When a doctor chose to see a patient instead of a prisoner, he changed not only one life, but how the world understood hunger, recovery, and responsibility. The story of Käthe Schmidt and David Morrison begins with one shocking sight. Legs so thin they could barely hold a body upright in a land of overflowing storehouses. It grows into something larger, a record of how a modern nation allowed its own people to starve, and how its enemy measured fed and healed them. The contrast is sharp. One side preached strength but lost control of bread and trains. The other side dropped bombs, yet kept its prisoners alive with careful attention and counted calories. They had come as conquerors. They left as students, learning that power without responsibility leads to ruins and empty plates. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance, and the choice to share it, even with those who once wore the enemy's uniform.